This PowerPoint presentation will discuss infection and will cover types of microorganisms, the chain of infection, the course of infection, virulence factors, diagnostic testing, and antimicrobial therapy. Infection. The definition of infection can be stated as the invasion by and multiplication of pathogenic microorganisms in a bodily part or tissue, which may produce subsequent tissue injury and progress to overt disease through a variety of cellular or toxic mechanisms. It is important to remember that just because microorganisms are present does not mean that an individual will have an infection or adverse result. Microorganisms are normally present in many areas of the body. There are over 300 different species of bacteria which live in the intestine. Bacteria and fungi live on the skin. The mouth and pharynx contain many species of bacteria, and the vagina contains acid-producing bacteria. Some of these microorganisms are useful, such as helping with digestion, while others are present but cause no ill effects for the individuals. These microorganisms depend upon their host, in this case a person, to supply the nutrients and environment for the organism to thrive. The body's intact defense system allows the microorganisms to be present, but not to cause illness or infection. Pathogens are microorganisms that are capable of causing infection or illness. Opportunistic pathogens are capable of producing an infectious disease if the health and immunity of the individual is weakened. The pathogen takes advantage of the individual's weakened ability to fight off the pathogen and takes the opportunity to produce an infection or illness. It is important to understand the different types of microorganisms. The textbook does a good job in providing basic information about each type. I do not expect you to know the fine details about each type of microorganism, but you should have a general understanding of the difference between the types. You will learn specific information in a microbiology course. Microorganisms can be separated into two groups by cell type. Eukaryotes, these pertain to an organism with cells having a true nucleus, meaning it is a highly complex, organized nucleus surrounded by a nuclear membrane containing organelles and exhibiting mitosis. That's a form of cell division. For example, fungi and parasites. Prokaryotes are organisms that lack a true nucleus and a nuclear membrane that reproduce through simple fission. For example, bacteria. Viruses are the smallest intracellular pathogen. They have a protein coat called a capsid, which surrounds a nucleic acid core. They have not any metabolic enzymes of their own, and so must use a host cell to replicate and make new viruses. Bacteria are single-celled organisms that do not have membrane-bound organelles. They are considered prokaryotes. There are different types of bacteria based on the shape of the cell wall and the means of movement. Bacteria reproduce by means of binary fission. Bacteria can produce toxins and do not need living tissue to survive. Exotoxins are proteins that are released by the bacteria during growth and damage or kill the host cells. Unlike endotoxins, their effect on the body is very specific depending on the bacteria and the host cell. An example of an exotoxin is a neurotoxin, which is released from the tetanus bacilli. Endotoxins are parts of the bacterial cell wall and are released after the organism dies. These toxins are released into the tissues and cause inflammatory response and produce a fever. The endotoxins can also cause serious complications in the circulatory system. Endotoxins are the most often present in gram-negative bacteria. Fungi Fungi are eukaryote and are found everywhere. They're found in humans, plants, and animals. The human body is fairly resistant to fungi infections and may be susceptible under certain circumstances, such as when a person's immune system is not working properly. Common fungal infections occur on the skin or mucous membranes. The reason that most fungi require a cooler temperature than the body's core temperature is to survive. Two examples are Tinea pedis, which is athlete's foot, and Candidiasis, which is often found in the mouth. These organisms are usually treated with antifungal drugs. No vaccines are available. Parasites. Parasites include protozoa, arthropods, and are actually members of the animal kingdom and live in or on the human body. Many of the parasites we are exposed to do not cause disease. Protozoa cause an illness by invading and destroying tissue, or they evoke the inflammatory response. Chain of infection. Just because one of these pathogenic microorganisms is present does not mean the person will develop an infection. There's a systematic process that occurs when someone develops an infection. All the elements must be in place in order for an infection to occur. This systematic process is called the chain of infection. The textbook discusses some of the links in the chain of infection. The following slides will review each of these links. The infectious agent can be any of the microorganisms we just looked at: bacteria, virus, fungi, or parasites. The infectious process depends upon the number of organisms, the virulence, or the ability to produce disease, the ability of the organism to enter the body, the susceptibility of the host. Some of the microorganisms have the ability to infect almost anyone on the first contact, such as smallpox. Other microorganisms have greater difficulty producing disease in the host. Tuberculosis is an example of this. The reservoir is the place where microorganisms live. Sometimes they will multiply in the reservoir and other times they will not. People are very common reservoirs. Some people are carriers of microorganisms. This means the person harbors the infectious agent and serves as a potential source of infection, but does not manifest any clinical signs of the disease. Other common reservoirs are animals, insects, food, and water. Reservoirs must have certain characteristics: food, oxygen, water, the correct temperature, the correct pH, and light. Portal of exit from the reservoir to the source means that once they have found a reservoir where they can grow, the microorganisms must have some means of leaving or exiting the reservoir. For example, if the reservoir is a person, the microorganism can leave through the skin, through the respiratory tract when they cough, the gastrointestinal tract, and blood. Mode of transmission. The mode of transmission refers to how the microorganism is transferred to the susceptible host. Some microorganisms have only one mode of transfer, such as airborne, while others have multiple modes of transfer. Healthcare workers focus their infection control efforts in breaking the chain of infection at this link. Their goal is to prevent the transfer of microorganisms from one person to another. There are 4 routes of transfer that can occur. The first one is contact transmission. Direct contact transmission means that direct physical contact between an infected person and a susceptible host. Examples of direct contact include touching, biting, kissing, and sexual intercourse. Then there is indirect contact transmission, which means the susceptible person comes in contact with contaminated inanimate objects, such as soiled tissue, toys, or soiled clothes. Droplet transmission means that the large particles from one person are passed to the susceptible person. Droplets are produced by sneezing or coughing. They are heavy and succumb to gravity within 3 feet. The susceptible host must be close enough so the microorganism can enter through the conjunctiva, nose, or mouth. An example would be the common cold. Airborne transmission means that droplet nuclei are encapsulated in saliva and suspend in air for a long time. They drift in air currents. Droplet nuclei are expelled from an infected individual and transmitted by air currents to a susceptible person, usually through the respiratory tract. And this can also be through coughing and sneezing, but also talking, singing, anything that would expel air out of the lungs. An example of airborne transmission is tuberculosis. So airborne droplets or droplet nuclei suspend in the air for a long period of time, up to 45 minutes. Then there's vehicle transmission. There are other vehicles that can cause indirect transmission of microorganisms, such as contaminated food, water, drugs, and blood. An example would be when a person has food poisoning. And then vector transmission. Vector transmission is when the microorganism is transferred to the susceptible host by an animal, mosquitoes, ticks, and lice. Lyme disease is an example. The organism is transmitted by a deer tick. Portal of entry. Portal of entry refers to how the microorganisms get into the susceptible host body. It is usually through one of the same routes the microorganism used to exit the host. Normal flora. These are microorganisms that normally reside on the surface and deep layers of the skin. These can prevent other bacteria from multiplying. Normal flora is not easily removed by hand washing. The skin serves as a physical barrier, but also provides a chemically unsuitable environment to support microbial growth, such as pH and sweat. The mouth provides a mechanical barrier to microorganisms. Saliva contains microbial inhibitors. The respiratory tract, the ciliary action traps microbes and sweeps them upward to be expectorated out of the body. The urinary tract, the flushing action of urine washes away microorganisms. The GI tract, the gastric acidity destroys microorganisms. Intestinal motility maintains even distribution of microflora. In the vagina, the acidic secretions inhibit growth of many microorganisms. Then the susceptible host. The susceptible host is an individual who is vulnerable to the invading pathogenic agent. We just reviewed the body's normal defense mechanisms. If these are all in place and the individual does not have certain risk factors, the person can usually resist infection. What factors make an individual more susceptible to illness? Well, age. Newborns and elderly have reduced defenses against infection and their immune systems are weaker. Nutritional status. If the protein intake is inadequate, the body's ability to synthesize antibodies can be impaired. Stress. Prolonged elevation of blood cortisol decreases anti-inflammatory responses, which in turn decreases energy reserves, leading to a state of exhaustion and decreased resistance to infection. Disease process. There are certain disease processes that predispose an individual to increased risk for infections. These include immune disorders in chronic diseases such as diabetes. Medical therapy, certain medical treatments can predispose an individual to increased risk for infection, such as radiation, chemotherapy, and surgery. And inadequate defenses. The skin must remain intact and not have any recurrent infections. Immunization status. People who have not received immunizations are more prone to infection. And trauma. To prevent infections from occurring, it is important to break one of the links. It is important for all healthcare workers to prevent the spread of infection from one individual to another. The key is to determine ways to break the chain of infection at several points. At the infectious agent site, we can disinfect or clean the skin or sterilize instruments before surgery. At the reservoir, we can dispose of body secretions in appropriate receptacles, change wound dressings when wet, and use the proper method of disposal for contaminated needles. At the portal of exit, we can teach patients to cover their mouth when sneezing or coughing. Since there are several modes of transmission, interventions will vary. But hand washing is the primary way to prevent transmission of an infectious agent to another individual. The primary way to break the link at the portal of entry is to keep the body's defense mechanisms intact. This would include keeping the skin and mucous membrane surfaces free from cuts. The susceptibility of the host. We can work on education on proper nutrition, healthy lifestyles, and keeping immunizations current. As a healthcare worker, it is important to understand how to break the chain of infection. The Center for Disease Control has developed guidelines that are followed when handling body secretions of all patients. There are 2 levels to the guidelines. Standard precautions, and these provide guidelines about how to handle body secretions for all patients. Hand washing is the key component for these guidelines. And then transmission-based precautions are the second tier of the guideline and are implemented for patients with specific types of illness. You can visit the CDC website for Part 2 on recommendations for isolation precautions in hospitals for more complete information.